In Planet Reddit, today's story is...
My father lied to me to miss my wedding, but 2 years later his stepdaughter called me desperate, and my reaction left her speechless. Weddings are supposed to be moments full of joy, love, and family unity. At least that's what I always believed. Ever since I was little, I dreamed of my father walking me down the aisle. The image was crystal clear in my mind. Him in an elegant suit, his firm arm holding mine, smiling at me as if I were still his little girl, even as I was giving myself to the love of my life. This dream stayed with me through the most difficult times, especially after my parents' divorce and when my father started a new family. Organizing my wedding was complicated. I had to balance a limited budget with my vision of the perfect day, which was really exhausting. But it was worth every effort. My fiancé, Matt, was my constant support throughout the process, cheering me up when I felt overwhelmed. We wanted our celebration to reflect our love story, with personal details like handwritten vows, a homemade photo booth, and my mother's delicious cookies as souvenirs for the guests. Everything was falling into place perfectly, except for one important detail: my father. When I told him about the wedding, his reaction was surprisingly cold. He told me he was happy for me, but there was something strange in his tone, as if he were reciting a memorized script. I decided not to make a big deal out of it, thinking that maybe it was just awkwardness. After all, our relationship was no longer as close as it had been, and his new wife Laura and their daughter Carly seemed to have taken up most of his attention in recent years. Despite everything, I was determined to include him in my special day. I asked him if he would walk me down the aisle, and his answer pained me deeply. He told me he would do his best, but that he couldn't promise anything because of his health problems. It wasn't the confirmation I was hoping for, but I convinced myself that it was enough. At least he was considering it. As the date approached, I kept asking him if he would be able to attend. He continued to evade the question, saying things like he needed to see how he felt closer to the day or that he had some medical tests pending. I wanted to believe him, but I had an uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. 2 weeks before the wedding, I called him again. By now, I was practically begging him to at least confirm his attendance. His voice sounded low, almost apologetic, as he told me that he probably wouldn't be able to make it. He said his arthritis was getting worse, and that traveling would be too much for him. I tried to be understanding. I offered to organize transportation and even suggested paying for a comfortable car service or booking a hotel near the venue, so he wouldn't have to worry about the trip. He replied that it wasn't about the logistics, it was about his health. He didn't think he could handle the stress. Hearing those words broke something inside me. I wanted to scream, to demand that he try harder, but instead I swallowed my pride and told him I understood. I didn't want to make him feel guilty. He was my father, and the least I could do was be kind about his decision, even if it hurt me immensely. My wedding day was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. My mother was beaming, taking care of the last details with dedication. Matt was everything I could have dreamed of: firm, calm, completely full of love. But as I walked down the aisle with my mother by my side instead of my father, I couldn't help feeling a twinge of sadness. I scanned the room, hoping against hope that he would appear at the last moment, but his seat remained conspicuously empty. The ceremony went perfectly. The guests laughed, cried, and cheered us on as we exchanged our vows. It should have been the happiest day of my life, but a part of me couldn't stop thinking about the person who wasn't there. A few days after the wedding, while checking social media, my heart stopped. There was my father, the man supposedly too sick to travel, happily posing on a sunny beach with Laura and Carly. The description mentioned something about a family getaway, with heart emojis and hashtags about bonding and relaxation. I stared at the photographs, my hands trembling in disbelief. There he was, grinning from ear to ear, holding a tropical drink in one hand and giving a thumbs up with the other. Laura seemed to be having the time of her life, while Carly posed in a new bikini. They all looked completely carefree and happy. It wasn't just one photo, there were dozens. Images of them on a yacht, eating in fancy restaurants, exploring picturesque trails, all during the same weekend as my wedding. The betrayal hit me like an avalanche. Not only had he missed my wedding, but he had deliberately lied to me, making up an excuse about his health while he enjoyed a vacation with his new family. The tears came before I could hold them back. I felt completely deceived, having worked so hard to accommodate him, believing his excuses, and even defending him when others questioned his absence. Not only had he disappointed me, but he had made it clear where his priorities lay. I showed the photos to Matt, who was as furious as I was. He hugged me as I cried, whispering words of comfort, but nothing could ease the pain I felt. My father hadn't just missed my wedding, he had actively avoided it, choosing to spend that time with people who hadn't been in his life for as long as I had. 4 days, I debated whether I should confront him. Part of me wanted to face him and demand an explanation, but another part of me was too exhausted to fight. I went over our conversations in my mind, analyzing every word I had said, trying to understand how I had failed to detect his lies. Update 1. I didn't know what to do or how to process my feelings. My emotions swung between anger and sadness, and sometimes I felt an unsettling numbness. Matt encouraged me to talk about it, but every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. How do you explain to someone that your own father made you feel expendable? The first time I heard from my father after the wedding was a week later. He called me in an overly cheerful voice, as if he could disguise the fact that he had missed one of the most important days of my life. He began by asking me how the wedding had gone. His tone was casual, as if he were asking about the weather. I gave him a curt reply saying it was fine, without going into detail. I didn't owe him a detailed account of a day in which he chose not to participate. Then he mentioned that he wanted to give me a gift. He said he felt bad about having missed the wedding and wanted to make it up to me. His exact words were something like, "I know I couldn't be there, but I hope this shows you how much I care about you." I should have felt some gratitude, but instead I felt a deep, simmering anger. Not the kind of anger that makes you explode in the moment, but a colder, sharper one, the kind that settles in your bones and refuses to go away. I asked him what the gift was. He said he would send me a check, a small token to help us start our married life. That's when I lost my composure. I told him I didn't want his money, that no amount of money could make up for what he had done. He tried to defend himself, saying he wasn't trying to buy my forgiveness, just to show me he cared. But his words sounded completely empty. If he really cared, he would have been there. If he cared, he wouldn't have lied to me. When I mentioned the holiday photos, his tone changed completely. He began to stammer, trying to explain himself. He said that the trip had been planned at the last minute, that Laura had booked it as a surprise, and that he didn't know how to refuse. He tried to justify himself by saying that he didn't realize it coincided with the wedding until it was too late. His lies only increased my anger. I reminded him that I had called him several times, practically begging him to come. He had led me to believe that his health was the problem, making me feel guilty for insisting, while he was enjoying cocktails on a beach. He tried to interrupt me by arguing that it was not what it seemed, that the trip was a family obligation. That word, obligation, made me even angrier. I asked him if he didn't consider that accompanying his only daughter to the altar was also a family obligation. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then he said something that really broke me. He said he thought I would understand, saying, "You're so independent, so strong. I didn't think you would need me there." It was like a punch in the stomach. My independence and strength, qualities that I had worked so hard to develop, had been twisted into excuses for his absence. I explained that being strong didn't mean I didn't feel pain, and being independent didn't mean I didn't need my father. By the end of the call, I felt completely drained. He was still trying to smooth things over, but I told him I needed time and hung up. The check arrived a few days later. It came inside a generic Hallmark card with a superficial message about love and happiness. There was no personal note or sincere apology, just an amount of money that felt more like an insult than a genuine gesture of goodwill. Matt asked me what I wanted to do with the money. He suggested we could use it for something useful, like paying a bill or saving for a future trip. But I couldn't cash it. Every time I looked at the check, I felt a wave of anger and sadness. For me, it wasn't a gift, it was a bribe, a way to absolve himself without really taking responsibility. I decided to return it. I wrote a short letter explaining my reasons, taking care to keep my words measured. I didn't want to explode or say something I couldn't take back. I simply explained that what I needed was not money, but his presence, his support, and his honesty. And since I couldn't offer him those things, I couldn't accept his check. Sending that letter made me feel like I had a small piece of my dignity back. I didn't expect him to reply, and he didn't. For a while, there was calm. I immersed myself in my new married life, concentrating on building a home with Matt and finding joy in the little moments. But the pain was still there, a dull ache that refused to go away. The real repercussions came a week later. My aunt, who had always been close to my father, asked me why he hadn't attended my wedding. I told her the truth, without embellishing or exaggerating anything. I simply explained the facts as they had happened. The news spread quickly through the family. Several relatives started to call me, offering their support and expressing their indignation. Some even confronted my father directly, demanding an explanation for his behavior. He was not happy with the situation. He called me furiously, accusing me of airing private family matters. He reproached me for keeping it between us, claiming that I was being vindictive by sharing what had happened. I replied that I was not responsible for protecting his reputation, especially when his actions were the real problem. I reminded him that I had given him every opportunity to put things right, but he had chosen to lie and evade his responsibility. The conversation ended with him saying he needed time to reflect. I knew I couldn't change the past or force my father to be the man I wanted him to be. All I could do was set clear boundaries and protect myself from further harm. Update 2. I let a couple of weeks pass, and it seemed as if the storm had calmed down. The calls from worried relatives had decreased considerably. Matt and I were beginning to establish a routine in our new life together. The weight I had been carrying felt a little lighter, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I could breathe without feeling constantly overwhelmed by the past. But just when I thought I could finally move on, my father showed up at my door unannounced. It was a Sunday morning. Matt had gone out for a run, and I was curled up on the sofa reading a book and enjoying the quiet solitude. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence, and my heart sank before I even opened the door. As I saw him standing there, emotions that I hadn't faced in weeks resurfaced: anger, sadness, and a painful disbelief. There he was, my father, the man who had disappointed me so much, standing in my doorway as if he had every right to be there. He looked different, somehow smaller. Perhaps it was the guilt I could see weighing on him, or perhaps it was that for the first time I wasn't looking at him through the lens of blind devotion. He was no longer my father, that figure who seemed larger than life itself. He was just a man, vulnerable and full of flaws. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes restless, as if he knew he didn't belong there. He asked me if we could talk, and his voice sounded unusually submissive, without the arrogance he had always shown before. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to slam the door in his face and protect my peace of mind. But something inside me, perhaps a persistent sense of duty or simple curiosity, made me step aside and let him in. I gestured for her to come in. She hesitated for a moment before entering, sitting uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa as if afraid of taking up too much space. I couldn't help but notice the change. She was no longer a child waiting for my father to show up and fix everything. She was an adult, and for the first time, I felt like I was in control of our relationship. This was not a conversation between father and daughter, it was a settling of scores. He began with an apology, saying he was sorry he had missed my wedding and admitting that he had handled everything terribly wrong. His words sounded rehearsed, and I could tell he was trying to make it seem like he understood how much he had hurt me. But it wasn't long before he fell back into his old habits, trying to justify his actions. He talked about the stress of combining families, how Laura had pressured him to prioritize her daughter, and how he felt torn between two worlds. I listened with my arms firmly crossed over my chest, not out of defensiveness, but because it was the only way I could keep myself under control. I didn't interrupt him at first, but inside I was seething with indignation. His excuses didn't move me at all. In fact, they only increased my anger. He wasn't taking any real responsibility, just shifting the blame onto everyone but himself. When he finished speaking, he looked at me expectantly, as if he expected me to absolve him of everything, to tell him that I understood his situation. But there was no forgiveness on my part, not that day or ever. I told him that I had listened to his explanations, but that there was something important that he needed to understand. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was a pattern of behavior that went back years. He had always put other people before me, Laura, his daughter, even his own pride. For years I had tried to make excuses for him, tried to understand him, but I couldn't do it anymore. He tried to interrupt me, but I raised my hand to silence him. I hadn't finished speaking. I reminded him that he had lied to me, assuring me that he was too ill to accompany me on one of the most important days of my life. Then he had tried to cover it up with a check, as if my feelings could be bought. Did he have any idea how that made me feel? As if I were worth less than a vacation, less than a lie. He looked away, his jaw tight, but I could see a flash of guilt in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he might sincerely apologize, but instead, he doubled down on his defense. He told me he didn't mean to hurt me, but that I had to understand that he was in a difficult position. Laura was pressuring him to prioritize his daughter. I interrupted him, making it clear that this wasn't about Laura, it was about him. He had made a decision. He had chosen her and her daughter over me, and he had been doing it for years. He always chose everyone else while I was left behind. At some point, he needed to take responsibility for his actions. My words hung in the air, and for a long moment he said nothing. I thought that maybe he would finally see the truth of the situation. But when he spoke again, his voice sounded defensive, as if he were the victim. He assured me that he had always tried to do the right thing by me, that maybe he had made mistakes, but that he was only human. He acted as if I was treating him like a villain, when according to him, he had done the best he could. I shook my head in disagreement. His best effort was not enough. If he couldn't recognize that, then maybe he wasn't ready to have this conversation. He stood up abruptly, his face red with frustration. He said he had come to make things right, but it seemed I wasn't interested in hearing him out. I stood up too, my heart pounding. I replied that I had been listening to him all my life, and all I had gotten was disappointment after disappointment. If he really wanted to fix our relationship, he had to start by being honest with himself. Until then, there was nothing more to discuss. He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. When Matt returned home, I told him everything that had happened. He listened in silence, occasionally nodding, his expression mixing sympathy with barely contained anger. He assured me that I had done the right thing, and that setting boundaries was essential, even if it hurt. His support meant everything to me at that moment. Update 3. The next day, my aunt called to tell me that my father had gone to her house after leaving mine, venting all his frustrations. He had told her that I was being irrational, that I was holding a grudge and refusing to let him make amends. A new wave of indignation washed over me. It wasn't enough for him to have hurt me. Now he was trying to present himself as the victim. That's when I made a drastic decision. I needed to take control of the narrative. I posted a detailed message in the family group about our confrontation. My father was furious when he found out, but by then I didn't care anymore. I was tired of letting him control the story. I laid everything out without reservation. Every lie, every excuse, every broken promise. I told them about the wedding, the fake health problems, the vacation photos, and the check that was supposed to buy my forgiveness. I explained how his actions had deeply affected me and why I had decided to set clear boundaries. To my surprise, most of my relatives were understanding. They recognized that they had seen how my father had been prioritizing his new family over me and agreed that his behavior had been deeply hurtful. My father, as expected, was furious. He accused me of trying to turn the family against him and of exposing our private problems publicly, but I stood firm. It wasn't about revenge, it was about responsibility. He had spent years avoiding it, but I had finished allowing it. If he really wanted to fix our relationship, he needed to do some serious soul-searching. In the days that followed, I received messages of support from relatives who were previously unaware of the situation. Some even told me that they had confronted my father, urging him to rectify his behavior. Whether or not he would listen to their advice, I didn't know, but I no longer felt that this burden was exclusively mine. Update 4. When I saw Laura's message, my blood boiled with indignation. Her audacity and complete lack of empathy left me speechless. I stared at the screen, reading her text over and over again as if hoping the words would magically change. But no, it was still the same message. Another attempt to present my father as the victim, another guilt trip disguised in polite language. He was telling me that I should be grateful for my father's attempts at reconciliation, as if his efforts to buy his way back into my life could make up for years of abandonment and a holiday during my wedding. Matt noticed my growing anger and came over to read the message too. He shook his head in disbelief. This is unbelievable. He's acting as if your father did nothing wrong." I jumped to my feet. "She's just like him," I said, my voice cold and determined. "Another one of his replacements." That word fit the situation perfectly. Replacement. Laura wasn't just playing the part of the perfect stepmother. She had become the exact image of what my father wanted. Someone who never challenged him, who never questioned his actions. A woman who had simply taken the place that my mother once had, together with her daughter. The idea made my stomach churn. The thought of her and her daughter trying to replace me and anyone else who asked my father to assume his responsibilities was unbearable. I sat back down, feeling a tightness in my chest that prevented me from breathing normally. I had to reply, but I had to do it very carefully. I took a deep breath, let my fingers hover over the keyboard for a moment, and began to type, allowing the whole truth to flow into each word. I began by calling her exactly what she was, a replacement. I explained that she had quickly entered our lives and tried to take my place, and that in doing so, she had stolen more than just my father's attention. She had destroyed the possibility of having a genuine family for both of us. I reminded her that she hadn't even been my father's first choice. He had walked away from everything I had known to embrace this new life, and now she was part of a team keeping him from facing the consequences of his actions. She hadn't just married my father, she had helped him destroy everything we used to have. I didn't hold back at all. I told her that I was always the one who was left behind while she played house with a man who no longer showed any interest in me. It wasn't even about her specifically anymore, but about the fact that she and my father had somehow managed to turn me into the villain for simply standing up for my rights and exposing their lies. And that was something I could never forgive. Then I was even more direct. I wasn't going to allow him to think that he had any right to lecture me on how I should feel or how I should handle my father's actions. I assured him with total conviction that he would never understand the pain I had experienced, not until he suffered the same betrayal. I told her that I hoped that one day her daughter would feel as I did, that she would find herself waiting for her father at a crucial moment, only for him to choose someone else. I wanted her to experience how cold and indifferent that felt, to know what it really meant to be replaced, and to understand what it meant to have someone you trusted walk away from you completely without a second thought. I told her that only when it happened to her would she understand the magnitude of what my father had done to me, what he had done to all of us. And I meant every word. I truly wished for her to feel that pain, the same suffering that had brought me to this point of no return. The message was long, but I didn't hesitate for a second when I pressed send. I no longer cared what he thought of me. I had been patient, I had been understanding, and I had been hurt beyond belief. I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite the story or make me feel like I was in the wrong. Matt, who had been reading over my shoulder, nodded silently. Well, that should set the record straight. I smiled slightly. Yes, I needed to know exactly where I stand in this situation. Update 5. I had made my final decision. My father was no longer welcome in my life. Our last conversation, in which I made it clear to him that I could not continue with this relationship, had been the final straw. Matt supported me unconditionally, every step of the way. The weeks passed, and the initial pain of my decision gradually began to fade. I concentrated on the future, on building a life with Matt that didn't include the emotional chaos that my father always brought with him. He tried to call me several times, but I never answered. He sent a few messages, but I ignored them completely. I no longer had any interest in hearing anything he had to say. It wasn't until 2 months later that I received a call that made my heart skip a beat. It was an unknown number. With some hesitation, I answered. On the other end of the line was Carly, my father's stepdaughter, the daughter of his second wife from his previous marriage. I hadn't spoken to her in years, and to be honest, I wasn't sure I wanted to now, but I couldn't ignore the desperation in her voice when she started to speak. She asked me if I knew where her father was, and I could barely make out her words, as they were choked by the trembling in her voice. She continued to explain, between sobs, how my father had suddenly left a month ago. She hadn't had any specific news from him, just a couple of sporadic messages with no real information. She was completely desperate, not knowing where he was or what had happened. Then she revealed something I wasn't prepared for. That very morning, her mother had received the divorce papers. He hadn't even called her. He had simply sent the legal documents. I couldn't help myself. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. The absurdity of the situation hit me hard. After everything that had happened, after years of excuses and suffering, he was doing exactly the same thing all over again. But this time it wasn't me he was abandoning, it was Carly and her mother. And although I was ashamed to admit it, a small part of me felt a certain satisfaction. Maybe it was the irony of the situation, or maybe it was just seeing how all the wounds I had caused were finally coming full circle. Carly, naturally, didn't understand my reaction. She heard me laugh and fell silent, creating a long pause between us. She didn't understand why I was laughing and how I could possibly be laughing. Without thinking too much about it, I found myself repeating the same words my father had said to me so many times. I told Carly that maybe she should stop being so dramatic, that it wasn't that big a deal. It wasn't the first time he'd left, and it surely wouldn't be the last. I wasn't going to apologize for my feelings, not after all the damage he'd caused me. The silence on the line went on even longer. Carly kept asking why he would do something like that, why he would leave without any explanation. I felt a strange emotional detachment as I listened to her, as if my mind had hardened against any compassion I might once have felt for her. I replied that she should have seen it coming. It wasn't the first time he'd done this, disappearing without warning, without caring about anyone's feelings. It wasn't a surprise. It was simply his usual pattern of behavior. She tried to argue, but I had no interest in consoling her. She was just another one of his victims, as I had been. I told her that I had already spent enough time pretending to be his daughter. If one thing was clear, it was that this had been predictable for a long time. He had never been a reliable person, he never would be. I suggested that if he wanted answers, he shouldn't ask me, but his mother. It was no longer my problem. Carly didn't reply immediately. Her breathing was shallow and I could hear her stifling sobs, but I felt no compassion. I couldn't feel it. She had been abandoned too many times, constantly disappointed by him. Why should I care now? She had been his stepdaughter. They weren't even related by blood, and like me, she was suffering the consequences of his actions. I ended the call without another word. There was nothing more to say. I put the phone down with a sense of finality that was strangely liberating. I wasn't going to apologize for my reaction. I wasn't going to apologize for cutting him out of my life. I had finally said enough. Maybe one day Carly would understand. Maybe she wouldn't, but that was no longer my responsibility. My only responsibility was to myself, and I was determined to put myself first. When Matt entered the room moments later, he immediately sensed that something had happened. He could see it in my expression and hear it in my voice. He asked me how it had gone, and I told him the whole conversation. He didn't question why I hadn't been more understanding or why I hadn't comforted Carly. He didn't suggest that I should have handled the situation differently. Instead, he simply listened carefully. He fully understood my feelings. He hugged me as I exhaled deeply, feeling the last weight I had been carrying for so long finally begin to disappear.